Okay, today I have the pleasure of introducing Mark Krafft. Today he'll be telling us about how to take back control of the internet.
Thanks for that. So I'm just messaging my wife right now to figure out whether my kids are listening, to whom I'm going to say hello in a second. So please allow me first to pay respect to the elders past and present and the leaders of the future of the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here and today. Jinjari Jimbelung. Hi, I'm Martin. I'm not nervous. I also didn't feel like I needed to redo my slides 3 days ago, which were otherwise already perfectly done. But I did. And I have a vision. I have a vision of a resilient internet where healthy competition and ethical design puts users at the center and gives them choice, personal agency, autonomy, and ownership of their data while respecting their individual privacy choices. I'm on a mission to empower children to become makers, not takers, of the technologies in their lives. And at this point in time, I would like to say hello to Veronica and Melanie, who are hopefully listening right now. And the way for me to do this is through education and providing alternatives. Thank you very much for joining me. So we're going to be looking today at decentralization, and specifically in the context of the web. And as I'm sure you know, the web was originally designed as a decentralized resource, which it really no longer is. We're going to be talking about re-decentralization and look at some of the reasons why that's a really, really hard thing to do. But I am going to make the case that a lot is at stake. And if we don't re-decentralize, then we're going to lose freedom, diversity, a lot of potential anyway. And that's why I consider it a necessity to re-decentralize. And the question is, how do we do it? The web, it's a fantastic resource, and it's hard to imagine a life without. I was going to show some cat pictures and all of that, but you know it, right? So I don't have to. What I do think I have to do is I have to rebrand the www because it's no longer accurate. I think we should be talking about the MMM. That stands for media, memes, and monopolies. The World Wide Web was originally designed with a couple of design principles in mind. I won't go into these in detail. Take a moment to read over them. And then ask yourself the question, is that representative of the web that we're using today? Well, I don't think so. You see, I think the web began dying in 2014. This is the thesis of André Staltz, whose writings have been really influential in the last couple of years. So thank you, Andrew, at this point. In 2014, two remarkable events took place. First of all, the cloud price indices plummeted sharply across all markets. And we may argue that the cloud is sort of centralization in sheep's clothing, which would mean that in 2014, it was the beginning of the end of the decentralized web. Something else happened in 2014, and that was that Google and Facebook had established themselves as the custodians and gatekeepers of information for half of all requests for information to web publishers. And this figure has since risen to 75% by the end of 2019, thanks to AMP pages and similar technologies. Today, the web isn't anymore the research network, the decentralized resource and the treasure trove that it once was and that it should be. Today's web is a collection of silos, also known as walled gardens, which exist to lock the user in and which fundamentally go against the principles of the web, such as interoperability, participatory processes, and decentralization. Now, why is this bad? Look, I'm not going to be preaching to the choir now. So here's a bulleted list. I am going to go a bit deeper on two of the terms here, being enslaved and the attention economy. And I'm going to start with the latter. But just out of curiosity, who of you here has heard of this term, attention economy? So that's roughly half, maybe a little less. Okay. The business model of most walled gardens that are out there in the social web we know today is that of maximizing your attention by showing you the content that's most likely going to get you hooked. For now, this is done so that the companies can show you more ads and generate more revenue. But who knows what the future might bring once they have your attention. These companies are doing everything and throwing lots of money at the question of how they can best remove your agency. And removing the agency from people, well, nothing good has ever come of that. The attention economy uses machine learning algorithms to build models of users, little voodoo dolls, so to speak. These models are bred, kept alive, constantly enhanced as the conglomerates extract more data from and about you. These models are then subjected to hundreds of thousands of tests on a continuous basis to identify the content that will most likely hook their real-world counterparts into the silos. And hey, if such experiments were performed on your captive physical self in the real world, it would land the executives of the companies in prison for crimes against humanity. Because we've learned. Over many centuries, slaves had their agency removed, and they were kept in captivity and forced to work for the economical benefit of farm owners or subjected to psychological and medical experiments against their will and agency. Aral Balkan, a European journalist and self-proclaimed cyborg rights activist, coined the term slavery 2.0, and it makes sense. What's happening nowadays is not that humans are being enslaved to work on cotton farms. Today, it's the humans themselves that are being farmed. They're locked in. Their data are stolen, models of themselves exploited by machine learning in massive server farms, purely for the economic benefit of the farm owners, and the similarities are striking. So the next time you hear Facebook or Google talk about users or services, such as in this announcement of the great Facebook outage of 2019, let's reformulate that so that it's properly addressing what they're really talking about. Yesterday, as a result of a master failure, many slaves had trouble getting profiled and farmed. We've now resolved these issues, and our stranglehold is recovering. We're very sorry for the money that we lost and appreciate everyone's attention. You're welcome, Facebook. So, and even though I'm aware that recent efforts exist to replace the master-slave vernacular from documentation and code, and that's all good and well, when it comes to drawing us and better monetizing our attention, I think we should be naming the things the way that they are. And so I'm going to have a list here of things we can do to save the web, and I'd like to start this list by encouraging everyone to speak of slave-master relationships rather than client-servers, and slaves instead of users when it comes to the attention economy. And we'll be continuing this list. And there are obviously a number of benefits to silos, no question about that. I'm not going to spend our time going through these one by one. Moxie Marlinspike, who's one of the driving forces behind the Signal Messenger, just recycled one of his blog posts at 36C3, the Chaos Computer Congress in Leipzig 2 weeks ago, to make the case and in an attempt to justify his decision to make Signal just another walled garden. A piece that has led Matthew Hodgson of the Matrix team to respond with the conclusion that even though the challenges of decentralization may outweigh the benefits, our freedom is at stake. Our freedom is at stake. The 4 freedoms, according to the FSF: the freedom to choose where and by whom you want your data stored and managed, the freedom to use whatever clients you want, the freedom to innovate, and beyond. Our freedom is at stake, and it's time that we fight for it. So what are these challenges that make it so hard to re-decentralize? I'm going to argue that a main reason for why re-decentralization is so hard is because the internet simply wasn't designed for it. And if you recall in the design principles earlier on, decentralization was one of the points, and that's true, but it applied to the governance of the internet and the World Wide Web, not to the techniques that are running it. Let me show you what I mean. First off, today's internet can address 4.3 billion entities directly, and due to the hierarchical nature of IPv4 addressing and the associating inefficiencies, that would not be enough to provide every fourth person on Earth with an address. These addresses are inflexibly and inefficiently assigned according to a mixture of first come, first served, geography, and capitalism, bestowing a lot of power upon those who run our infrastructure. Now, we've worked around this with hacks such as network address translation, but that prevents people from directly contacting each other, which is forcing us to communicate via relays and therefore enabling a market for middlemen. And this middleman market gave rise to companies such as Facebook. Because, hey, when Mark Zuckerberg says Facebook connects friends and family, what he really means is Facebook connects friends and family to Facebook. And that explains the powerful position that this company has attained and which it is constantly abusing. When IPv4 was designed, it was perfectly natural to pick 2 to the power of 32 as the address space. That's the unsigned integer. It was also natural to represent the IP address as a dotted quad and to use those 4 digits as a sort of rudimentary routing framework. Nobody back then foresaw the growth of the internet, and nobody could fathom that one day we'd be facing IPv4 address depletion. But the decision to address entities on the internet as unsigned integers may have been the spark that would eventually incite the raging wildfire that is Facebook. And I'm sorry, Australia, for using this metaphor in these times. There are millions of lives at stake in New South Wales and beyond, and it seems wrong to draw the parallel. But at the same time, let's not forget the role of companies like Facebook and Google in the spread of fake news, empowering climate change deniers. So what about IPv6? That's going to solve all our problems, right? We're already at 30%, and it only took us 25 years. The IPv6 address space is big enough so we can assign a unique IP to every square centimeter on the Earth's surface, enabling direct communication between pretty much any entity with any other, without middlemen. Unfortunately, many of the end-user benefits of IPv6 actually spell out negative economic incentives to the infrastructure operators who are currently making money off the scarcity of being able to publicly address entities on the internet. And even when IPv6 adoption reaches tipping point, and despite efforts such as mobile IPv6 and entire address spaces dedicated only to the peer-to-peer web, IPv6 is still mostly hierarchical in nature, which peer-to-peer is simply not. However, a web with IPv6 is better than a web without IPv6, and so I'd like you all to encourage you all to please demand your 48 or 56 prefix from your ISP, or vote with your feet. There are also very promising projects such as CJDNS, which is aiming to do provider-independent IPv6 addressing. Very interesting stuff. And we'll be coming back to this list. But first, let's go back to the design flaws. There's another aspect of the web which makes it inherently centralized: locations. The concept of URLs, as well as HTTP per se, is location-centric in that the the location addresses content. But locations are subject to change. And in that way, the web of URLs and HTTP was never designed for posterity. I read somewhere that the average validity of a URL is 45 days, and even though I can't find the source anymore, I don't really have trouble believing that. And if it weren't for incentives such as archive.org, who are doing an outstanding job preserving the content on the web, we'd be losing some of the stuff that has been written forever. And while that's true for 99% of the content on the web, the 1% really make it worth it. So please consider donating to archive.org. I'm not affiliated with them, but I support them myself. Anyway, as I just said, locations host content, which means we can call this the location-centered web. Now, what would the web look like if we actually addressed content instead? It'd be the content-centered web. Hey, I need this particular file. Anyone in the room's got it, and could it send it over? I'm sure some of you remember the modem days, tweaking Squid to avoid re-downloading big files, and opting for SneakerNet rather than going via the pipes. Imagine if your file system or browser did this automatically in the background. You need certain content, and it would fetch it for you, however was easiest. Imagine if that was the new normal. Oh my bunny ears. That's what my kids would be saying now in secular New Zealand. Well, I'll tell you what. The content-centered web is already happening. Perhaps the most well-known project venturing into this domain is called the Interplanetary File System, which is a little bit like if Git married BitTorrent and then they'd start a family on the file system layer or something like that. A distributed hash table keeps track of where to find content, building a resilient, efficient, and backbone-independent resource, and there are even provisions to make this human addressable. Another promising project of the content-centered web is the Beaker browser, which builds on top of the DAT protocol, which was designed by scientists to share huge amounts of data peer-to-peer, keeping track of changes all along the way. The browser is also the web server, which means that everyone is participating. And to those familiar with Tor, that's a little bit like Tor, except without the obfuscation. And then, of course, speaking of, despite the reputation of Tor as the web for criminals aside, Tor does let you offer services independently from connectivity between you and your users, whether you need the included anonymity or not. And it's probably not by accident that the user experience on the darknet isn't very far from the web in the 90s, except there's less use of a blink tag. There are no trackers. Websites are required to work without first forcing you to download megabytes and then execute JavaScript in your browser. And yet, innovation is taking place, albeit not in the same way as in the centralized web, because there is no requirement for middlemen. And a lot of what's happening there is happening at the fringes of society. And when you're constantly on the run, it's the innovative that survive. So yeah, even though I'm aware of abuse happening on the darknet and certainly won't endorse any of that, here's another thing you can do to help save the web. Use Tor and offer your services there as well. A lot of popular websites are already doing this, and thus independently from the location-centric web, people are able to access their content. This will help make Tor more mainstream, which will help everybody who needs Tor and drive innovation that ultimately will move us further away from the location-centric web. And much in the same spirit of mainstreaming technology that protects our privacy, Donna talked about it this morning even, I'd like to cheat and slip in another point here right now, which is encrypt, encrypt, encrypt. And by that I mean end-to-end encryption to which we'll return. And this list is not over. But now that we've moved a little bit beyond the location-centric web, it might have occurred to you that whether you're using IPFS, the Beaker browser, the DAT protocol, or Tor, the content served will most likely have been ultimately produced by people. Do you remember MySpace? MySpace may have been the first commercial service that made the location about a person and made the person the content. Today, that's pretty much all of what the social web is all about. Profiles about people with content from locations served by middlemen. Can't we cut them out? Imagine a social web that put people first. It would be called the people-centered web. Let's have a look at what that would look like. And so in the context of LCA 2017 in Geelong, I was introduced to this project called Secure Scuttlebutt. Serendipitously, a year later, it moved to Wellington, New Zealand, which just so happens to be the center of development and also with most users of Scuttlebutt on site, which is why I'm here now wearing the appropriate t-shirt. Scuttlebutt is sailor parlance for gossip, water cooler talk, whatever you want. And in some ways, that is exactly what the project is about. Users have public keys. That's their identity. That's the location at where their content is found. Their content is a logbook that is append only. Within the network, or with the help of so-called pubs, users gossip about each other and carry content between those who follow each other. Today, it's mainly a social network of people living off-grid, solar punks, and those active in the P2P space. And it works remarkably well to the point that you entirely forget that you are not actually connected to a central server that's curating your content. And the underlying technology has already been used for chess, for NPM registries, and also for Git. Now imagine off-grid Git collaboration without having to track the remote. Sounds good, doesn't it? I could spend a lot more time showcasing you peer-to-peer applications that transcend the location-centric web, but let's not. There are tons of alternatives. And I encourage you to get your hands dirty using one of these tools I just introduced. And there are multiple resources out there that will have lists of tools that you can try so you don't have to go by what I say. For instance, redecentralize.org's Alternative Internet is a collection of alternatives to the default go-tos of the siloed web. And I'll just flick over a couple of screenshots of the list they have. Pretty much everything in the domains of cloud, collaboration, hosting, messaging, networking, social networks. Tons of tools that simply don't fit any of these standard categories. It's pretty much something there for every taste and every application. And lots of these projects are beyond beta phase and well maintained. So yeah, have a look. Because, you know, there are alternatives, but why aren't more people using them? Now, who's read the abstract of my presentation? Well, you've been warned, and if you haven't read the abstract, you're living on the edge anyway, because it did threaten to talk about my PhD research. Which does not mean that I'm not sorry, but here we go. I did spend 4 years of my life researching adoption behavior among Debian developers when it comes to version control systems. And this is the pretty graph that I came up with. 4 years. I identified 21 influences that shape these adoption decisions, many of which apply to other fields in tech. And I've highlighted 9 of those that are most relevant, especially to the context of what we're talking about here today. Now, don't worry, I won't take you through any of them. I did promise to mention my PhD research, which I now did, and that's going to take me a couple of slides while I shuffle myself out of that situation, so please bear with me. And even though it's sort of a meta-influence, the one that's of utmost importance to keep in mind is that innovation takes time, and it's really, really hard to speed that process up. But that doesn't mean that it isn't happening. And so among the things to do to save the web, keep at it. Don't give up. We're in for the long haul. And if you're old enough, you might remember the early open source days when pretty much nobody could imagine we would ever move beyond Windows 95 and 98. And all of us Linux and free software aficionados were likened to Don Quixote fighting the windmills. Well, hello, LCA. 25 years later, here we stand. I'm going to skip going through these lines. The point is the trend. Open source software today is pretty mainstream. We're far from done. But we are here because we didn't give up. And we're also here because the open source proposition is just too good to be turned down. Given the combination of universality, bottom-up design, independence, progress was unstoppable. We had to get this far. And the content and people-centered webs, which share much of these values, are similarly propositions that are simply too good to pass up. And it is already happening. I'm not going to talk about traction right now. Some of the brightest people are working on projects such as IPFS and many more. And it won't take 25 years this time. As Donna said this morning, the future will come, and you can't stop it. Be part of it. So a co-working space that I sometimes frequent has 2 types of coffee on offer. There's the dual filter coffee machine that pretty much has coffee all the time in limitless quantities. And then there's the Italian espresso machine. I personally love using the espresso maker. Yeah, I sometimes get it wrong. Sometimes my coffee is burnt. Sometimes I get sloppy with the milk. I simply love it for the control it gives me. And one day, in that co-working space, just after I had spent 5 minutes making myself a wonderful flat white. In walk 3 people. One pours filtered coffee for the others. They're done after 1 minute. Then they notice my work of art and start talking about the art of coffee making while sipping the filtered coffee. I'm not saying filtered coffee is bad. There's very good filtered coffee, but that was plain filtered coffee. And whether I managed to bring across the scene properly or not, the irony was staggering, believe me. It's like when people use WhatsApp to discuss privacy issues or search YouTube to research echo chambers. And I've encountered many such situations. People's shoulds and their actual do's are often misaligned, and Donna again admitted in her keynote this morning that she doesn't do the things she should do when it comes to reducing her digital footprint, for instance. And I'm sure the same applies to most people, in here, out there, to everyone. It's everywhere, and it's a rabbit hole once you start looking for it, so don't. I've started calling this the dental floss paradox because everybody knows that you ought to be flossing your teeth every day, and, well, you're right. Just like everybody knows that filter bubbles exist, and yet you still use Google to search the web. And with reference to my PhD research from earlier, the factor of influence in play here is what I called resistance, which boils down to the question, what is hindering me? And very often the answer to that question will be app fatigue, which is basically the same as, look, I've tried quite a lot, and it all just kind of sucks, leave me alone. Between the carrot and the stick, we know very well that the stick doesn't work. But we have to also consider that we all work within constraints and that the available carrots aren't all pretty. In fact, I liken open source alternatives to the organically farmed carrots that the supermarkets keep in the back alley, not out front in the bright light. They just happen to taste better, but it still requires effort on behalf of the customer to go and search them and buy them. And then they'll be more expensive too. Most everyone wants to do good, but not everyone is privileged enough to be able to. And sometimes the availability of alternatives, the shoulds, will possibly make things worse. As individuals, we'll start accumulating a bad conscience, which will make it even harder for them to do anything about it. So what does this mean? Should we give up? I certainly don't think so. Because one advantage that we have right now in this day and age is that awareness is rising. Awareness about the dangers of surveillance capitalism, the attention economy, and problems with social media in general. People still lack the ability to do something about it, though. And the result is resignation, even defiance. I want to chat with Julia. Why can't I find her on WhatsApp? Oh yeah, that's right. She mentioned she doesn't like Facebook. I should really be doing something about that, but that's for another day. Also, everyone is on WhatsApp, so Julia. What app was it that she was using? Whatever, it wasn't important anyway. We've all been in situations like this, where we spend more than half of the time trying to figure out how to get in touch with someone rather than to get in touch with someone. And to say the least, this is not respectful of the human user. This is not an instance of what Aral Balkan, who I mentioned earlier, calls ethical design. This idea stems out of a manifesto the Indie Web Foundation published in 2017. At the lowest level of this pyramid, there's technology. And here we must respect human rights. Ethically designed technology respects and protects your civil liberties, reduces inequality, and benefits democracy. And it's fair to say that we've paved this path quite far already, and this is where blockchain comes in, for instance. But perhaps we have gone a little bit too far, too focused on the technicalities and too focused on the technology. Perhaps we haven't been paying enough attention to the people walking down these paths. And where it says respect human effort, we need to understand the limitations and constraints that every one of us faces every day being human. We need to get stuff done, and our efforts need to be rewarded, not punished. Ethically designed technology is thoughtful and accommodating, not arrogant and demanding. It understands that you might be distracted or differently abled. It respects the limited time you have on the planet. And then finally, ethical design aims to make the human experience delightful. Such technology just works. It's intuitive, it's invisible. It recedes into the background of your life. It gives you joy, it empowers you, it puts a smile on your face every time you use it. remember trying to get in touch with Julia? Well, this is what it should look like, right? You open your address book, pull up Julia's details, or you talk to Siri or whatever that is. Who cares? But you press that one chat button, and the next thing you see is Julia asking what's up. Who cares about what protocol is being used in the background? Now, this would be convenient, right? This would be delightful even, at least compared to what we have nowadays. So yeah, when it comes to things to save the web, let's put ethical design in there. And we're almost done. But first, no talk of mine would be complete if I didn't mention the Matrix project. And I'm not saying that Matrix is at the point of providing a delightful user experience, not at all. It's on a promising journey in the right direction, though. It's a federation. It doesn't shy away from the difficult problems, such as multi-device end-to-end encryption, which other projects simply toss in the too hard basket and don't do. But there is a strong focus on user interface and experience in the project. There's a management of user expectations going on, especially when it comes to end-to-end encryption. And one of the core strengths of Matrix is furthermore the concept of bridges to other protocols. And within the constraints of each of these protocols you see here, it's already possible to use your Matrix client to speak to folks using IRC, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, WeChat, Discord, you name it. And finally, the Matrix team works really hard to prevent fragmentation in the federated space through a transparent governance process around the specs, and again, management of expectations among their contributors. And one component of Matrix is the identity server, which currently only serves to help people find each other using email addresses and telephone numbers. And that's obviously a huge challenge in terms of privacy. And to be honest, I don't even think that the Matrix identity server is currently GDPR compliant. But there's work on the way to address that. Data will be encrypted such that even the server operator won't be able to read it. And ultimately, my hope is that you'll be able to define policies that will allow other people to get your Matrix ID simply by proving that they know your email address already. And obviously, this will be hidden from the user because it's got to be delightful. Now, I realize I've been throwing lots of content at you, and I hope it's been inspirational thus far. And there's one last part to my presentation, and it's possibly the one that I'm most excited about, and if only because I know the least about it. So my hope is that one of you, or two, or many, will come up after this and show me all the cool things. I say let's build some competition for the internet, because competition is what keeps the market players in line. And especially seeing how legislation and regulation are failing to do so, this seems to be the only way we have left to draw up some lines and force companies like Google and Facebook within them. And when I say competition to the internet, what I'm talking about are mobile ad hoc networks, which are a specific type of mesh networks. On the web today, every device is connected to a router or a cell phone tower, which has an uplink to an ISP through which I can reach the backbones of the internet, and this forms a graph which is very hierarchical, especially down at the leaves. Mesh networks, on the other hand, are completely chaotically interconnected. One device may be linked to several, others may act as routers between networks, and mobile ad hoc networks further add the complexity that it's assumed that these things move around all the time, so the connectivity within the mesh can be changing multiple times a second. And yeah, I know nothing about this space, but I'm still going to give you a state of the MANET address. The field is 25 years old, roughly, but it remains mostly a research topic. And that is in part because I think it's really, really hard to get this sort of functional connectivity going. But that isn't to say that it isn't possible. And there are a couple of applications putting mesh networks to work successfully. The One Laptop Per Child project comes to mind, whose software component wanted to enable children to work with each other without an internet connection. And there are several other chat applications, for instance, in the domain. FireChat received 500,000 downloads during the Hong Kong protests. And I only highlighted Manyverse here because it's actually a mobile client for Scuttlebutt, written by Andrew Stoltz, who I mentioned earlier as well in this talk. iOS 7 introduced multi-peer connectivity. Of course, Android doesn't have it. Well, you can enable it, but it isn't enabled by default, which is probably because it's a threat to telcos to have mesh networking enabled. And that's also one of the reasons why mesh networks aren't more popular, apart from being mighty complicated and us being nowhere near the stage of development where it's easy to try out the technology, even though even if you're an advanced user. Whoever provides your phone has absolutely no interest in you using mesh networking. The platforms aren't open enough for people to easily jump on board. Also, mesh networking has low bandwidth compared to what we're used today. And strangely enough, people are so used to connecting to the internet through an ISP using an uplink that they simply expect things to be that way, even though it's counterintuitive. People don't communicate hierarchically. We communicate peer-to-peer in real life. But here's the thing. At the end of last year, slightly more than 2 in 5 people weren't connected to the internet. And those people neither have preconceptions about how the hierarchical internet or the siloed web works, nor will they be bothered by low bandwidth, because low bandwidth is still more than no bandwidth. And what's more, 2 in 3 people already own a mobile phone capable of mesh networking. And even though the median is currently only 45% across emerging economies, this trend is rapidly rising. If you put these numbers together, the 53.3% here is the estimated fraction of mobile internet use as of 8 days ago. Not that it's of any relevance to what I'm saying right now, but I found the number and I had to put it into use in advanced mathematics. It's not hard for you to see the potential of mesh networking that doesn't grow out of the existing internet. So what about Google and Facebook? Of course, it would be surprising if the hungry behemoths hadn't already fixed their eyes on this. Google calls their effort to bring the unconnected under their control Project Loon, while Facebook calls it internet.org. Hey, and seeing that there makes me much less offended about their choice of TLD now that ICANN has sold out. So we are in a race against these ruthless players with unlimited wallets, right? Yeah, we are. But we have one massive advantage over them. Because while Google and Facebook somehow have to connect those 41.2% to their servers so they can be farmed, we don't. And so we don't have any capital expenditure getting these people connected to each other. So where does this leave us? Remember the 1 laptop per child project and how it failed making the $100 laptop? Well, here's an easy answer to that. The next time you get or buy a new smartphone, put a custom ROM on your old one and make it a mobile ad hoc network node. And imagine doing that at scale. This idea came to me on the flight over, which is why I rewrote large parts of this presentation in the last 3 days. It also means I haven't been able to research this a lot. And I want to crowdsource at this point. And if you know anyone who does know anyone, or you know anyone directly, or you have some ideas about this, please come and talk to me. And with that, I'd like to conclude the list of things to do to save the web with a plea to help build a competition for the siloed web using old smartphones that are empowered to build mobile ad hoc networks. And a couple of things you can do to save the web are here. Donna offered an Etherpad this morning, so I'm going to put that on there as well. And there's no question that this is not an exhaustive list, and hey, you may even disagree with a point or two. Maybe I completely missed the big points. I kind of find this a bit weak myself. I'm sorry about that. It's the best I could do. However, we have to start somewhere. We've seen repeatedly how the centralization of influence in loosely regulated, commercially motivated technological companies can have serious repercussions for society. And to pretend that this is not an issue and to accept the status quo would be to neglect our duty as human beings to leave this place better off than we found it. Donna beautifully called you all to action this morning as well. Thanks, Donna. Decentralization is perhaps only the first step on this journey, but it is one that we must take. And there's one last message I'd like to leave you with before I hope you'll have some questions. Who of you folks in this room has children or has started to think about children? Put up your hand, or don't keep them up in your head if you don't want to disclose it. Right. Keep your hands up, please, please. Now, those who already have an answer to the question of how you're going to introduce your children to the smartphone use and the internet, the web of today, put your hands down. I'd like to talk to you afterwards, please. But if your hand is still up, or anybody else in the room at this point, I'd like you to consider that the children of today are similarly not yet connected to the internet and also do not have preconceptions that might make it more difficult for them to embrace a people-powered web, people-first web. They also have no bandwidth. So my parting thought is that we might one day be able to outfit our kids with smartphones that will let them communicate and collaborate with their friends without selling their soul to the people farmers before the kids were able to make their own decisions. So that's me for today. Thank you very much for your attention. I also want to thank the LCA team for the opportunity to speak, my wife Penny for enabling me to be here, all the forward-thinkers in the domain, and many of whom I didn't mention here. And really thanks to everyone who's up for the battle to save the web. It's happening. It can't be stopped. But we still need you to get there. Cheers. Do we have time for questions? 3 minutes?
Yes.
There's one.
Yeah, verbally. Is the internet being
One sec.
scrubbed of old content?
Is the internet being?
Hi, thanks. Is the internet being scrubbed of old content, like 80s posting of jokes, which I can't find anymore? I think you would know.
Well, I don't think the internet is being actively scrubbed, but I think that it's becoming increasingly difficult to remain relevant if you're not part of the big silos. And so people lose motivation, grow older, and stop running their own servers, which powered a lot of the decentralized web.
Any more questions?
There's one.
Yeah.
If you're staying for the rest of the, thank you for this. If you're staying for the rest of the conference, would you be willing to organize a little meeting on decentralization, a buff on that?
Yeah, I've been doing that the last couple of years, actually, at LCA. I haven't gotten down to, because I've been rewriting my slides, I haven't really thought about it, but yeah, I'd be up to that.
Great.
Absolutely. Or find me. Literally, I'm going to put everything down and sit you in front of my laptop or your laptop, and we'll get you started. Donna. I can repeat the question as well.
It's not so much a question as recycling. There's an answer rather than a question about the recycling at scale.
Nice. It works.
Computer Bank. I don't know, some Victorians would probably be familiar with Computer Bank. They've been recycling hardware for a long time and putting free software on it, so I think it's definitely something that can work. And with this community, we can probably find ways.
Thank you. I might put that on your Etherpad.
Please do.
All right, I think I've exhausted everyone, including
Okay.
myself. Thanks very much.